Greetings, and thank you for joining this installment of the Family Forum series offered by the Sioux Falls School District with experts from Avera. My name is Jeremy Mollett, and during this session, we will focus on the topic of grief and loss. This session will include some helpful advice on identifying grief, how it can impact your child, and what steps you can take to be a valuable resource to them. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. James Nold, Assistant Superintendent of the Sioux Falls School District, to offer a welcome.
Good evening. On behalf of the Sioux Falls School District, I again want to welcome you to this 9-part presentation that is titled the Family Forum Series. But first, I want to take this opportunity to again thank Avera for their partnership with the Sioux Falls School District in providing this service to our families. This is the 7th installment of this series, and we hope you found the previous presentations and information to be of great benefit. You are welcome to watch all the previous presentations that have been recorded and are available for your viewing at the Sioux Falls School District Counseling website. You are also welcome to join us on the third Tuesday of each month to hear information on a new topic. Each topic is intended to strengthen and support our families by providing information and resources that exist right here in our community. And now, I look forward to hearing from our presenter this evening. And please do not hesitate to provide us feedback on the Sioux Falls School District Let's Talk app that can be found on the Sioux Falls School District website. Thank you again, and now back to Mr. Mollett to introduce this evening's presenter.
Thanks, Dr. Nold. We'll now move to the presentation. We're pre-recording this session, so won't be taking live questions, but we will leave some time at the end to address some of the top concerns we hear from parents. Tonight's program will be presented by Amber Reintz. Amber is a psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner at Avera Behavioral Health Hospital. Welcome, Amber, and thank you for presenting.
Thank you, Jeremy. Again, I am Amber Reintz. I'm a psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner and have worked at Avera Behavioral Health for 15 years. I'm very thankful to be joining you this evening and very thankful for the Sioux Falls School District for coordinating this event. So tonight we are going to talk about grief and loss. As Jeremy talked about, we're going to talk about what grief is. We'll describe some different models regarding grief, and we'll describe some different practical approaches that we can take as parents to help our children who may be experiencing grief. To get started though, we'll start first with what is loss and what is grief. What is loss? It's when something or someone leaves or changes. And this can be a variety of different things that our kids may experience. It may be death of a family member or death of a friend. It can be when they're moving houses or moving schools. Maybe it's when a pet passes away or a change in friendships. What we know is that everyone experiences loss, and grief is really that natural human response to loss. The difficult part, though, is while we know it is normal, it can still be very overwhelming, especially for children who are experiencing this for the first time. We may experience all different types of emotions, and for kids, this may be the first time that they're experiencing some of these emotions, or certainly the first time that maybe they've experienced them so intensely. So for example, while children maybe have experienced sadness before, they may not have experienced the intensity of sadness that they may feel when a loved one passes away. We know that coping can be difficult, and we understand that the process of grief and the effect of our well-being is challenging, but the first step is what we're talking about tonight, is how do we help to move towards healing, and how do we help our children to be able to move forward? One thing I want to pause first though and talk about is when do we grieve? Because I think sometimes as parents, we may be discounting the number of times that our children are experiencing grief that maybe we're not validating for them during those times. So certainly death. Many times when death happens, we understand that there is loss and that there's going to be grief. In divorce, I think many times initially when divorce happens, we as parents maybe are able to recognize that there is going to be a grieving process. What we may forget though is sometimes the secondary effects of that divorce that they may also grieve. Maybe the first time that they have Christmas now with separate families, they may be going through another grief cycle. We see a change in friendships and a change in relationships. And again, this is difficult because as adults, we can think back of the times that maybe we've had breakups or maybe we've had friends that no longer wanted to be our friends. And in the moment, we can sometimes look at our kids and maybe minimize the impact that that is having on their life at that time. Certainly, we experience pet losses. We see people who are moving homes, maybe changing jobs or grade levels or schools. And when I talk about change in schools, I'm not talking about just the person who maybe leaves and goes to a new town to a new school. We sometimes experience grief when we even move from elementary to middle school to high school. We may even experience grief when we're changing teachers. And sometimes we'll see this kind of as the school year begins to end. We'll sometimes have some anticipatory grief of that this teacher is no longer going to be my teacher in my life. Sometimes we see losses in performance expectations. So maybe I tried out for the play, but I didn't get the part. And there may be a grief reaction to now I'm not a part of that play group. Or maybe the team was supposed to go to state and we lost the first round. Again, many times in those situations, we as parents can sometimes see bigger picture and sometimes be able to see that they're going to be okay. But we need to be careful that we're not minimizing a grief experience that that child may be experiencing. So tonight we're going to talk about how do we help our children in grief? And one way is to educate ourselves about grief. And that's why I'm very thankful that each of you are taking the time to talk through this tonight. To start, I want to talk first about what are some myths and what are some facts about grief. There is a myth that says that grieving should last about a year. But the fact is, there's no specific time frame for grieving. How long it takes differs from person to person. And I appreciate this visual on the screen because oftentimes society has an expectation. They sometimes say that you get a year, maybe even 2 years, but after that, you have to be able to get over it. And the reality is that's not realistic. The reality is, depending on the loss, we may grieve the rest of our lives. If I had a grandparent who is now physically not going to be in my life, I will continue to grieve for the rest of my life, and that is okay. And this is a really important piece that we want to help to remind kids, is that it is okay for you to continue to grieve. Another myth is that there is a right way to grieve. But the fact is, your grief is as unique as your fingerprint, and the journey through grief is personal. And this is what can be hard as parents, because as adults, we have maybe learned how we go through grief and what is helpful for us, what is supportive for us, but that doesn't mean that that's going to be the same for our child. And so for our child, we have to help them learn on this new grief journey what is going to be helpful for them. Another myth is it's important to be strong in the face of loss. But the fact is, feeling sad, frightened, or lonely is a normal reaction to loss. And crying doesn't mean that we are weak. And I really want to challenge you as parents that this applies to adults too. I myself am a parent to 2 younger boys. And I have to remind myself that when my boys were a baby, when I wanted them to smile, I didn't tell them to smile. They saw me smile and they replicated that. And the same is true for us as adults when we're trying to help our kids to grieve. We can tell them that it's okay to be sad, that it is okay to cry, that it's okay to talk about their feelings. But if they don't ever see their parent do that, the likelihood of them doing it dramatically decreases. And so too often I hear parents talk to me about the fact that they can't let their child see them cry because they need to see their child as strong. But yet they're saying that they want their child to cry. So I really challenge you, in grief, our kids are watching us. And just like it's okay for us to cry, for us to feel sad, it's okay for our kids too as well. Another myth is that it's important to find something to replace the loss. And the fact is, it's important to help children understand to work through the feelings versus replacing it. And I think one thing we have to challenge ourselves as parents is we have to be careful of what patterns we're trying to create. So I think of the first time that my children had a pet fish pass away. When Bob passed away, my first reaction as a parent was to go get another fish because I wanted to fix that pain for them and I didn't want them to have to go through those feelings of grief. But the difficult part is sometimes as parents, we get frustrated when our teenager has a breakup and the next day they have a new boyfriend. But the difficult part is one of the things we have to consider is what patterns have we created over time of how we do work through grief. If we begin to show them that the solution to grief is just fixing it and finding a replacement for that pain, we are not going to be surprised when that continues to happen as they get older. So again, I challenge you, we don't have to replace that loss. Instead, we want children to learn that it's okay to experience those feelings. Another myth about grief is that we just need to keep busy. While coping skills can be healthy to manage the intense feelings, we want to be cautious of using busyness to avoid the feelings of grief. And I love this quote on the screen because it says, keeping busy can be a dangerous short-term distraction from pain, because at the end of the day, not only are you tired, but your heart is still broken. And again, I challenge us that these are patterns that sometimes we are unintentionally reinforcing for our kids. So I give the example sometimes that my kids, they love to go swimming and they like to take their beach ball and they like to push it underneath the water. And why do they do that? Because they love to see it pop back up. But the difficult part is sometimes this is what we are doing with our feelings. That when I start to feel sad because I've experienced a loss, or I start to feel angry because I've experienced a loss, instead of allowing that feeling, some of us are taking those feelings and pushing them underneath the water, just like the beach ball. And how we're keeping them under, some of us as adults are with busyness. If I just pick up extra shifts, if I just keep myself so busy, I don't ever have to stop and feel those feelings. But the difficult part is that for us as adults, that beach ball pops up and those feelings are still there. And again, we want to be so careful that this is not something that we're trying to teach our kids. That again, if they start to feel sad or start to feel overwhelmed, just keep them busy enough so they don't have time to cry or they don't have time to feel sad. Again, these are behaviors that unfortunately would then continue into adulthood. So really challenge you, it's okay to pause in grief. It's okay to allow those feelings. Another myth about grief is that there's a right and or wrong way to grieve. For example, if you don't cry, it means that you aren't sorry about the loss. But the fact is that crying is a normal response to sadness, but it's not the only one. And those who don't cry may feel the pain just as deeply as others. They may simply have other ways of showing it. And when I work with children in grief, this is actually a statement that I hear a lot, that people are telling them how they should grieve, that they should cry, that they should go for walks more because that helps their parent and therefore they need to go for walks more. But the difficult part with shoulds is that shoulds can create shame. The definition of shame is that there's something wrong with me. And so sometimes what's happening in grief is not only are they experiencing the feelings of grief, because we're putting shoulds on them, that they should cry and maybe they just can't cry, they sometimes start to tell themselves as well, I just don't know how to grieve the right way. But the reality is there isn't a right way. So we want to be careful of, again, putting those shoulds on our children. Another myth about grief is that grief follows a timeline, or AKA, shouldn't you be over it by now? But the fact is, this just puts a lot of pressure on us. Regardless of where it originates, it can lead grievers to feel like they haven't grieved the right way if they still cry about the person 1, 5, or even 20 years after the death. Truth is, grief is a process. It is not an event. And so sometimes when you look at even this visual on the screen, at the top, this is sometimes what society tells us grief is going to be like for us and maybe for our kids, is that people tend to believe that grief shrinks over time. And they really want you to get to a point where that ball doesn't even exist in the jar because that way you're, quote, over it. But the reality is what really happens in healthy grief is the grief may remain, as I stated, for the rest of our lives. But what we begin to learn is how to build that life around the grief. We learn how to move with our grief. That's what's healthy, not to feel like we just have to, quote, get over it. Another myth about grief is that if you follow the steps, you will find a cure. And the visual on the screen is really how people want grief to work. They want a very linear line of this is how I go through grief, just like how I go through an infection, do this and the infection will resolve. Grief is not a diagnosis. It's not something that we're trying to cure. How grief actually works is that there are not steps that you have to take. Instead, it is messy, and we are not seeking a cure. What we are trying to seek in this is healing. Another myth about grief is that grief only affects us emotionally. It only makes us sad, or maybe it makes us angry. Truth is, grief comes in many shapes and many forms, and it looks and behaves very differently for each of us. So grief can in fact impact us emotionally. It can impact us socially or mentally. It can affect us cognitively or physically, and it can impact our relationships. But let's talk through that. So mentally and cognitively, what we will see in kids as well as adults, but focusing tonight on kids, we will see sometimes they're more forgetful. They may be more disorganized, and we can see that sometimes in the school setting. We can sometimes see that just in the basic tasks of life, where we ask them to get up and get dressed, and normally that is not a task that is difficult for them, but now they're getting distracted, even just being able to get up and get ready in the morning. They're sometimes more confused more often. We sometimes see more mood changes or more of that instability. Sometimes they just seem just so overwhelmed. And again, I challenge you that I know this is sometimes hard for us as parents, because for some of us it was many years ago. But sometimes when we think of, again, like a breakup that happened, we're not acknowledging that maybe what's happening and why they just seem so overwhelmed with every aspect of their life is they are grieving a breakup. Sometimes they just seem more afraid of loss of control and just overall have more uncertainty in life, asking a lot more questions. Grief can as well impact us emotionally. Again, when many times people think of this, though, a lot of times parents will tell me that of course their child is sad, but sometimes we're not necessarily recognizing all the other feelings that our kids may experience. Grief is a time that I believe that we can help kids to actually learn more about feelings and learn more about their emotions. And so I really encourage parents. On the screen right now is a feelings wheel. You can go to Google and find there's lots of different feelings wheels out there. The reason why this is helpful is because many times if you ask kids about feelings, they will describe that they can be happy, sad, or angry. But truth is, there's lots of different feelings. And in grief, we feel a lot of different feelings. And this is a time where kids can begin to learn, what are these feelings? What do they feel like? One of my favorite researchers uses the statement, we have to name it to tame it. And too often as parents, we are trying to help our children tame a feeling that they haven't even named yet or recognized. And so sometimes even this is a good conversation piece for us as parents with our kids, of pulling out a feelings wheel and maybe again trying to show our kids that it's okay to have different feelings. It's okay maybe to sit down with my child and say, since grandpa passed away, I am feeling a lot of sadness. I am feeling a lot of just overwhelm. But I also do feel joy, and I still do see joy and feel joy when I still watch you play basketball. Again, those are things that us as adults begin to learn, that it's okay to have lots of different emotions in grief. But for kids, they sometimes, again, because of some of those should statements that we talked about, feel like, well, I should just feel sad because that's what people tell me I need to feel. This is where we can help them to learn that it's okay to have a lot of different emotions. The second visual on the screen I appreciate, because sometimes we think of feelings being too much, I would say, like in silos, where I'm angry or I'm sad or I'm mad. Truth is, many of us who have experienced grief, I think, would identify that many of us feel much more like the visual on the screen, where it is a messy combination of multiple emotions, and that is okay. Grief can affect us socially. So we sometimes start to see more changes in relationships. This can be with family and friends. We sometimes see a disinterest in socializing. So maybe before they used to spend a lot of time with their friends and now they're withdrawing more often. We sometimes start to see a disinterest in activities that were once pleasurable. So typically they enjoyed going to the movies or they enjoyed playing volleyball, but now they're kind of pulling away from those activities. Sometimes those activities become harder to pursue. And sometimes we start to see isolation, where they're starting to withdraw from relationships. Especially with isolation, this is something that we have to be very cautious with in grief. Because what we know about isolation is that when feelings are overwhelming, sometimes we begin to kind of pull away and we begin to isolate more often. But naturally, if you even ask yourself, when I isolate, when I spend a lot of time alone, what kind of feelings typically come up? Many times it's depression, and many times it's anxiety. And with that, then we can kind of get caught in this cycle between isolation causing some depression and anxiety, that depression and anxiety causing more isolation. I begin to isolate more, it causes more depression and anxiety. So this is a cycle that unfortunately our kids can kind of get caught in. So this is where we want to help our kids to understand balance. Is it okay to still spend some time alone when I'm grieving? Certainly. But I want to make sure that I'm doing it in balance, not to the point where I'm withdrawing from all of the activity or from social conversation with family, friends, etc. Grief can impact us physically. So sometimes kids will start reporting headaches, stomach aches, muscle tension, difficulty sleeping, and restlessness. And I like this visual on the screen because I do think one thing we forget about as parents, kids are not going to always correlate grief to my physical health. And so because of that, they might be complaining to you of, gosh, my muscles just hurt all over, but they can't necessarily describe or understand that that might be some of the grief response that they're experiencing. So that's our role as either parents, or it's definitely our role for us as professionals to help you with this, that if you have a child who's all of a sudden starting to report more and more physical complaints, this is where, again, sometimes, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, when do I reach out for help? This is a time where, again, especially if those physical complaints are interfering with their ability to be able to function in life, this is where we may need to seek professional help. So does grief impact children differently? Yes. Children may grieve differently based off of different developmental milestones. And again, if you think about your child, as they have aged, they began to see the world differently. So naturally then when they go through grief, they also see grief differently. Tonight, we're not going to go through all of the different developmental milestones, but what I would tell you is there's a resource on your screen of doggycenter.org, and you can certainly go there and it will talk through for different age groups, things that you may see in your child based off of their developmental age when they're going through grief. But just some overall statements that I'll make is children may not yet understand what happened or its implications. So we, for example, as a parent may understand that when an uncle passes away, that Christmas is going to be different next year. That maybe, again, family reunions are going to be different next year. We may understand the financial implications for that uncle's family because of that passing. But kids many times are more in the here and now. So they may not see the implications of what this looks like for months or years to come, and that's okay. And this is an important piece for us as parents, because as parents, one thing we have to look at is what information can we filter for our child to make sure that they are getting information that's important for a child to know versus information that adults need to know. And that's an important piece that if you want to try to protect your child, which again, a lot of us are trying to do in grief, that is a question that we do have to continue to ask ourselves. Based off of their age, what information do they need to know versus what information are adult conversations? Children may be overwhelmed by feelings, again, feelings that they're feeling maybe for the first time. And we talked about that. This is a time where in grief, we can sometimes learn. And this is a time where we can help our children learn about feelings, learn how to process those feelings. And this is something that actually can come maybe even good from grief. Children may express grief indirectly through behavior. So when I work with children, I look at children a lot of times like an iceberg. And what we see on the top of the water is not necessarily what's underneath. So on the outside, we sometimes see kids who are maybe more violent. We may see sometimes more refusal, even to just do the simplest of tasks at home or at school, they are now refusing. Sometimes we see that they're unkind, as they're sometimes just more irritable. And our role as parents, and again, this is one of the times that I would really challenge you, this is where sometimes professionals can help us to better understand what's going on underneath the water, is that if we are able to understand what's underneath the water, that is how we can impact the behavior that we're seeing on the outside. So is it just loneliness that they haven't really felt before? Is it boredom because this friend who used to be their friend now isn't necessarily spending time with them and they're all of a sudden bored and they haven't really experienced this much boredom before in their life? Is it anxiety that they've never kind of thought through how death does occur? And then the fact that not only does death occur, but death will continue to happen in my life. If we don't help them understand the feelings, the experiences that they're having underneath the water, we may continue to see those behaviors on the outside. This is a time where, again, reaching out for professional help can be very important. So we've talked about the myths and the facts. Another way we can help our children in grief, though, is to educate ourselves on different models of grief. Researchers have for years been looking at what are different ways that people can walk through grief. What I will just say is that models can help to provide a guide for us. We can kind of take, though, from different models, different pieces that maybe make sense for our child. So when I talk about grief, especially to children, many times I'll talk about the 5 different stages of grief. And the reason why I do this is because in the academic setting, especially for teenagers, many of them are still learning in school about the 5 stages of grief. So when I ask them what they know about grief, many will reference the 5 stages. So these 5 stages were developed by Kubler-Ross, and this model really says that there's different stages that we may go through. Denial, this can't be happening. The anger, why is this happening? The bargaining, make this not happen, and in return, I will. The depression of I'm too sad to do anything, and then maybe the acceptance of I'm at peace with what has happened. In the grief community, this model, however, is somewhat controversial, partly because the way in which we have now started to describe it to people is not the way that it was developed. Grief is not linear. You don't go through a checklist of stages. And with kids, they may not verbalize those different stages. Instead, you may see it more as behavior. So that shock and denial, rather than seeing that they may not say to you, I am stunned or this can't be happening. Instead, they may show you the behavior of the lack of affect, or they're just not engaging. Instead of sadness, about maybe they can't state to you, I'm so sad and lonely, you may see the sadness with low mood, low energy, or poor sleep. Instead of the bargaining stating I'm so overwhelmed, you may just see some of that shutdown behavior. Instead of stating that anger of they abandoned me, you may see more of that tantrum, aggression, and conflict. And instead of stating acceptance of I've loved and I've lost and I'm moving forward, you may see a behavior of just starting to see them develop new routines. So in kids, not only is grief not linear, you may not actually hear those statements. Instead, we may need to be looking for that behavior. But one of the things I try to remind people is that, again, the 5 stages were meant to be a framework. You may not feel all of them, and that's okay. But the other piece of that framework is that when they're written in a list, sometimes for kids, they feel like, well, if I went through denial, sadness, bargaining, anger, and acceptance, now that I'm at acceptance, I'm no longer going to be sad. So I'll have kids come to me and say, I'm not grieving the right way. And when I ask them to describe it, they'll say, because I had accepted this, but then their birthday came and I really missed them and I was really sad, so I must not be doing something right. But that's just simply not how grief was designed. Instead, what Kubler-Ross would say is that this was a framework. And so I talk to kids a lot about, think about it like a pinball machine. And on the outside of that pinball machine are all of those different pieces of shock, sadness, bargaining, anger, and acceptance. And depending on what life throws you, sometimes that pinball will hit up that anger, and that's okay. And then sometimes it hits acceptance, and you might feel like, you know what, I can move forward. But then something happens, and it maybe kind of triggers that pinball to hit the sadness. That's okay. That's what grief looks like, is continuing to move through these different feelings without feeling like we just get to acceptance and just stay there. One of the understudies of Kubler-Ross was David Kessler. And David Kessler said that while he appreciated the 5 stages, he challenged that there had to be something more. And so he has actually done work on the 6th stage of grief, which is meaning. The piece I would just say about that is that we do have to be cautious, because sometimes when you talk to kids about finding meaning, finding good in what they've gone through, that's where they want to jump to. And so they'll tell you, well, I didn't feel anger, I didn't feel sadness, I just found good in this. But the difficult part with that is we have to be careful that they're not just pushing away those feelings versus allowing themselves to feel them. A different model of grief is called the task-based model. And what this looks at is it uses the statement of TEAR to understand grief. So the T is focused on trying to accept the reality of the loss. So as parents, maybe helping our children to understand what acceptance is. And a key piece for kids is understanding that acceptance does not mean that I have to like it. So the fact that John does not want to be my friend anymore does not mean that I have to like that he doesn't want to be my friend anymore, but at some point I may need to accept the fact that that is reality. The E is to experience the pain. And we've talked about this tonight, but that's really allowing ourselves to go through all of these different feelings of pain and sadness and guilt and anger and helplessness and any other feeling that we may be having. Again, one of the things we want to allow kids to understand is that it is okay to have your feelings and find a way to express those feelings. For some kids, that might be writing. For some kids, that may be drawing out their feelings. For some, it might be using music to be able to express those feelings, or maybe talking to family and friends. The A is to adjust to a new world without the deceased. And with that, we sometimes do begin to ask the question of, is there something good that maybe has come from this loss? So for example, a child who has had a grandparent pass away, when they look at that grief, they may be able to look at it as, because grandpa has passed away, I'm very sad, and that's okay. And mom is now not going to spend as much time at grandparents' house and maybe can be present with me. And that's an important piece in grief, is that we don't have to feel like that the good has to cross out the bad, but maybe see both sides of that. And then the R is trying to reinvest in the new reality. So what rituals around that remembrance will help? Maybe it's creating memory boxes. Maybe it is spending time at the cemetery. Maybe it's continuing that activity that I used to do with that loved one. So if grandma and I used to cook together a lot, I'm going to continue cooking because that helps me to feel grandma's presence in my new reality. Another model of grief is continuing bonds. So the quote on the screen says, "Death ends a life and not a relationship." And that's something that for some kids is really helpful to consider, that even though maybe my friend is no longer physically here on this earth because my friend has passed away, I can still engage in rituals to help me still feel connected to them. So maybe it's wearing special jewelry. Maybe it's planting a garden, because when I'm in that garden, it helps me to continue to share that, to talk to others about that legacy or share that person's legacy and make sure that they're not forgotten. Maybe it's creating a photo album or writing letters. For some people, continuing to talk to that person who is deceased is helpful for them. Again, this is an example where for our kids, we don't have to tell them that they have to do these things. It's about us learning, maybe seeing what is helpful for our child. So we've talked about different models. We've talked about education. Maybe as parents, the piece that I would challenge the most is not that you feel like you have to choose that model for your child, but maybe just help them to understand the importance of choosing to walk through the grief. And when I talk to kids about this, I use the learning of Dr. Mark Vanderbroek. And what he challenged was that grief can be seen as a winter storm. And I think all of us in South Dakota, especially this year, can appreciate that we know what winter storms are like. They are unpredictable. They change our plans. It creates a lack of self-control, lack of sense of control. And one of the things that I think many of us fear with winter storms is we know that they're going to continue to happen. When you look at that list, grief is very similar. It's unpredictable. Grief challenges us to change our plans. It makes us feel like we don't have much control in this world sometimes. And we fear the fact that grief is going to continue to happen. So when we think about the storm, we can go through a storm in 3 different ways. The first is the turtle. And I'll often ask kids, what does a turtle do in a storm? And many can tell me that they hide in their shell. And this is what some of us want to do. And I talk to kids about that sometimes it feels like that's the safe thing to do. It feels protective. However, what we know is that when we try to keep grief in, trying to be like that turtle, just trying to keep it all inside, we know that it's going to continue to hurt us. It can affect us again more emotionally. We can talk again about how it can affect our relationships, because it's hard to put ourselves in new relationships when we're still holding on to all of the pain of the last relationship. It can affect us again mentally, where it's hard to think straight. And so oftentimes with kids, I'll try to remind them that in the storm, the turtle goes into the shell because it feels safe. And I get that in grief, it sometimes feels safe to just go inside. But when we do, it's hard to move forward. The turtle walks slow for a reason, and it's hard for us to move forward trying to keep all this grief in. We can sometimes be like the bald eagle in the storm, where we try to avoid the storm. And what does a bald eagle do in the storm? They actually fly above the clouds, and they try to avoid the storm below. And some of us try to do this in grief. And for kids, we do this in different ways. Depending on the age, some of us put our time into video games. Some of us may put our time into relationships, phones, gaming, drugs, alcohol. Why do people do those things? Many times it's because the feelings of grief are overwhelming and they don't want to have to feel it. But a lot of times what we have to help kids to understand is if we try to avoid the storm, just like the bald eagle thinks that it's working at that moment because the storm is below them and they're not having to feel it right then, eventually they have to go down and they have to feel that storm. And the same thing is true for us in grief. We can try to avoid it, but I'll also often remind kids that that's why sometimes people 20, 30, 40 years later are still trying to work through the grief of something that happened so many years ago because they've tried to avoid it all this time. So the last animal then is the buffalo. And what does the buffalo do in the storm? They do two things. The first thing they do is they gather their herd. And this is an important piece because for kids, we want them to understand that grief is hard, it is heavy, it can feel overwhelming, but they don't have to do it alone. And what we want them to understand is that there is a herd of people that want to help. And then a lot of times I'll ask kids, and you can ask your child, who is in your herd? Who are the people that can help you? Are there friends? Are there family? Are there school professionals? Is there a professional counselor that maybe we need to add to this herd? We just want kids to understand that walking through a winter storm is scary, just like going through grief alone is much too difficult. The second thing that the buffalo does, though, is they turn and they walk into the storm. And nobody wants to walk through grief, but the only way that we can continue to move forward in grief is to turn and walk through the storm, to go through the feelings, to allow ourselves to go through that pain. That is how we're going to find healing. So as a parent, I consider you certainly a part of your child's herd. And how can you help? We've talked tonight about educating yourself. We've talked about that importance of challenging our children to go through the process, making sure that they're not alone in that process. But some other things that I would encourage you to think about. One is to provide the space to express their feelings, but I really challenge you to avoid the fix-it trap. So we want to normalize the effects of grief, that it's okay to be sad, that it's okay that sometimes life gets harder to do, and it's sometimes work for me right now might be harder because I'm going through grief, just like school might be a little harder for you right now, and that's okay. We want to challenge, though, that this is an important time to connect with our child. We want them to understand that grief is done better together than alone. We want to make time to engage in activities to make space for the conversation, and that it's okay that even though we're sad, it's okay to play. It's okay to have fun. And as parents, probably too often, we expect that our child is going to talk to us by sitting at the kitchen table, looking across to us, giving us eye contact and talking about feelings. That's just not very realistic. Instead, sometimes where our kids are maybe more willing to actually talk to us is when they are playing that video game, that they come and just sit and be present so that they have a space to bring up that conversation. Or that instead of sitting at the table, maybe it's asking our kids to go outside and throw the ball around. And sometimes while they're a little distracted with that activity, they'll sometimes be more willing to bring up those feelings. I really challenge you to avoid the fix-it trap. When my kids fall and scrape their knee, my reaction is I want to fix it. I want to get ointment, I want to get a Band-Aid, and I want to put it on that skin knee as quickly as possible because I want it healed. And sometimes in grief, that's what we want to do too. And so when bad things happen to our kids, our reaction sometimes is trying to put a Band-Aid on it by saying everything happens for a reason, or at least they're not suffering anymore. And while those things may be true for a child, it can often lead to feelings of being misunderstood. Because if I am so hurt because Sally no longer wants to be my friend, and your response is that everything happens for a reason, you must not understand the sadness that I feel every time I walk into school, Sally doesn't even look at me anymore. So instead, what I would challenge is don't feel like you have to fix it. Sometimes just stating back, I'm sorry this happened. Do you want to tell me about it? Sometimes just stating back, this hurts. This is hard. Really challenge yourself, especially now is a time to really listen more than we talk. Sometimes when our kids are going through grief, the best response that we can do is to repeat back to them what they say. This is called reflecting, so that they know that they've been heard. So if they say, I am just so sad because I don't know what to do anymore when I go to school and I have a new teacher and this is really hard. Instead of, again, putting that Band-Aid on and saying, oh, you and this teacher are going to find a way to make this work. It's going to be okay. Be careful. Instead, sometimes just saying back, I hear what you're saying. Sounds like you're telling me that this is hard. The piece I remind parents is that if our kids do not feel heard by us and do not feel like they are being listened to, they will go find someone who does listen. And that's sometimes hard for us because as parents, sometimes they come to me and they tell me that they're frustrated because the child will talk to their friends, but they won't talk to their parent. And some of that's always going to happen, right? Some of us probably talk to our friends sometimes more than we talk to our own parents. But the piece I also try to remind parents is what we can control in that is to try as best as possible to make sure that our kids feel heard in the moment. Provide consistency and routine. So especially when death happens, life is an upheaval. And with that, one of the things we can do as parents is to try to create safety and predictability. And so helping our kids to, again, have sleep routines, make sure that meals are still being served. If you as a parent are going through grief yourself and you're not hungry, this is still a time to continue the routine of making sure that we have a meal on the table, that we're creating that same routine that we had before the death. Another important thing we can do as parents is understand your own grief reaction. So just like I'm challenging you to allow your child to grieve, if you have gone through difficult times, I'm challenging you too need to grieve. Without acknowledging our own emotional struggles, we can't maintain our capacity to support others. With that, I sometimes give parents the analogy, we can all relate these days to cell phones. And when we go through difficult times and when we ourselves are grieving, think of yourself kind of like that cell phone kiosk. And your children are going to come to you with their cell phone, kind of challenging you, please charge me. I'm emotionally hurting, please help charge me. Maybe your parents or the other siblings in your family are going to come to you and say, I need you to charge me too. And the reality is we still have to continue to do life. And so at work, we're still charging everything else that has to be charged at work. But some of us as parents are forgetting that if we don't plug the kiosk in, we're not going to be able to continue to take care of our children or the things that have to get done at work or the other people who are needing our help. And so even though you may not want to stop and take time and go through your own grief, I really challenge you, it's going to be hard for you to help your child if you don't help yourself. This is a time where we have to understand our own trauma reaction and again, pause and care for ourselves. Another thing we can do is offer choices. So many times when death happens or when grief happens, we a lot of times feel very powerless and kids begin to feel that. So something we can help our kids to understand is what do they still have power and control over? So what decisions do we want them to still be able to make? Maybe it's making decisions about clothing. Maybe it's making decisions about the arrangements, helping them to see that they still do have choices even when things feel out of control. This is an important time to make sure that we're including the school as part of the herd. How can our school help? You guys have great resources at Sioux Falls School District. This is a time to make sure that we're reaching out to those resources and making sure that educators understand what is happening in your child's life right now. That can help them to be able to help to support your child. This is a time where we may need to collaborate on strategies to promote academics, especially we talked about that routine and structure. So naturally, sometimes when kids are hurting, their reaction is to want to avoid. They maybe don't want to walk into school because they're afraid that what happens if I break down and start crying. But this is a time where structure and routine that the school setting provides is so important. So with that, maybe it's identifying a safe person at the school that child can go to, who they're able to go and talk to when they feel overwhelmed. This is also a time where, depending on the situation, making sure that the peers or the classmates are aware of what has happened so that they too can help to support your child. An important piece in this is knowing when to seek professional help. So when you have a child who's blaming themselves, maybe a child who's describing feeling numb, or you're seeing a pattern where they're starting to disconnect from others. Maybe when your child is no longer taking part in the activities. So they initially missed basketball, but now it's been a couple weeks and they still haven't returned to basketball practice. We may need to be seeking professional help at this time. Your child shows more school refusal or is continually falling behind in academically. Oftentimes when school refusal happens, the reaction a lot of times is we look at there must be something happening at school. Actually, a lot of times what research shows us is that sometimes school refusal is sometimes more about things that are maybe happening at home. Maybe there's again grief or loss that is happening that's not being treated. Maybe your child's expressing feelings of hopelessness or helplessness. Maybe your child's struggling with their regular routines such as eating or sleeping or grooming. Overall, if your child just seems stuck. So when we talk about those different stages, maybe they're just stuck in that anger or they're stuck in that sadness to the point where they're not continuing to experience life. That's where we want to make sure that we're reaching out for help. So counselors and professionals can help us to learn how to identify and express emotions. They can create a safe space. And the reality is, when we talk about you maybe considering yourself kind of like that cell phone kiosk, maybe right now you just don't have the emotional energy to be able to provide that support to your child because you yourself are hurting. That's where professionals come in and can be that space. So to end tonight, again, I want to challenge you. This presentation isn't telling you how to fix grief. I hope what you're hearing is that this presentation is really talking about how do we help our child to find healing in grief. We don't get to put grief in a box and put it on our shelf and tell our child to just move forward. There isn't a cure to this, and that's what's hard. Instead, we are seeking healing. It is not about moving on or letting go. It is about learning to help our child learn how to live with the grief. I've included some references here. These are references that may be helpful for you as a parent to go to, as they have a lot of different parent resources. I also always want to remind you, though, Avera certainly wants to be a resource for you as well. If you go to our website, www.avera.org, there is a list of many mental health professionals that want to be there to either support you or help your child while you are grieving. I thank you again for participating in this presentation this evening.
Amber, thank you for that information. That was an incredible amount of information for our parents and is a great resource. One thing that comes in as a question for many of our families, especially parents that call in and talk to counselors, they're worried a lot of times that a high school, middle school student, whoever it is, may have stayed too long in that stage of anger or the stage of depression. Those are probably the two most significant ones that they see that cause them the greatest concern. So how would you help a parent that is concerned that they maybe stayed in that stage of anger or depression too long, and where can they turn for resources?
Yeah, thank you. That is a very good question. And the piece that I think we want to help kids to understand is that it is okay to be sad. Sad is not bad. It is okay to be angry. The difficult part, though, is that when those emotions begin to affect the way that we're trying to live. So, for example, that sadness is at a point where I'm not sleeping at night, or that sadness is at a point where I can't concentrate at school because the tears just keep welling up in my eyes. That is where we really want to help kids to understand that while it's okay to have these feelings, we don't want to be at a point where these feelings are stopping us from being able to live. And so we can actually help to use that conversation to help them understand why we want them to go seek help. Because while we're okay with you being sad, we want you to be able to continue to live your life around this grief. And so that is really where reaching out to a professional, reaching out to your school resources can be very helpful. Again, here at Avera, you can go to the website of www.avera.org and you'll see a list of mental health professionals who can help you in having that conversation with your parent, with your child. Maybe again, sometimes if your child's not willing to go get help, I sometimes hear that from parents, maybe it's you going to go get help, learning some of these skills, and then that helps us to be able to better help our child.
Thank you to Amber Reintz for presenting tonight's session on grief and loss. Our next session will focus on how you can help your child resolve conflicts. This will be presented on April 18th from 6 to 7 p.m. and login information will be under the Counseling Services area of the Sioux Falls School District's website. Thank you for joining us and have a great night.